The shelter was never meant to grow this big. What started as a small family endeavor to save a few stray dogs had turned into something else entirely. My parents, bless their hearts, couldn't say no to any creature in need. So, over the years, the number of animals at the shelter had grown from a handful to dozens, then to hundreds. Dogs, cats, rabbits, even the occasional goat or bird, all found their way to us, and we welcomed them with open arms. But love alone wasn't enough to keep the business afloat. My name is Atina, and I was born into this life. As far back as I can remember, I was surrounded by animals. They were my playmates, my comfort, and my responsibility. I learned to feed them, to care for them, to nurse them back to health. My parents instilled in me a deep love and respect for all living creatures, and I carried that with me as I grew older. But as the years went by, I began to see the cracks in the foundation of our family's shelter. We were taking in more animals than we could afford to care for. The bills piled up. Vet bills, food costs, maintenance expenses. Donations trickled in, but it was never enough. My parents were always worried, always stressed, but they never let it show in front of me. They worked tirelessly day and night to keep the shelter running, but I could see the toll it was taking on them. When my parents passed the shelter on to me, I knew I had inherited more than just a business. I had inherited a legacy, a dream they had poured their hearts into. But I also inherited the financial mess that came with it. The shelter was on the brink of collapse, and I didn't know how to save it. I tried everything I could think of to turn things around. I reached out to local businesses for sponsorships. I organized fundraisers. I applied for grants. But no matter what I did, it never seemed to be enough. The shelter was just too big, the costs too high. The animals kept coming, but the money didn't. I'll never forget the night when it all came crashing down on me. I was sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of unpaid bills, trying to figure out how I was going to keep the shelter open for another month. I was exhausted, mentally and physically, and the weight of the responsibility felt like it was crushing me. I broke down in tears, feeling utterly hopeless. I loved those animals with all my heart, but I didn't know how to save them. That night, something inside me shifted. I had heard about manifestation, about the power of thoughts and intentions to shape reality, but I had never really given it much thought. But in that moment of despair, I realized I had nothing left to lose. I needed a miracle, and if there was even a chance that manifestation could help, I was willing to try. I wiped away my tears and took a deep breath. I closed my eyes and imagined a different reality. I imagined the shelter thriving, with enough money to care for all the animals. I imagined families coming to adopt them, giving them loving homes. I imagined the stress melting away, replaced by a sense of peace and fulfillment. Every night after that, I repeated the process. I visualized the shelter's success. I felt the emotions of relief and joy as if it had already happened, and I affirmed to myself that it was possible. I did this with a fervor I had never felt before, pouring all my energy into the belief that things would get better. At first, nothing seemed to change. The bills were still there, the donations still scarce. But I kept going, kept believing, kept visualizing. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. It started with a small grant that I had applied for months ago and forgotten about. The money wasn't much, but it was enough to pay off some of the more pressing bills. Then a local business offered to sponsor one of our fundraisers, bringing in more money than I had expected. It wasn't a windfall, but it was a start. I noticed other changes, too. More people began to show interest in adopting our animals. Families who had never considered adopting a pet suddenly found their way to our shelter. drawn by something they couldn't quite explain. The animals, who had been languishing in the shelter for months, were finding homes one by one. Encouraged by these small victories, I kept up with my manifestation practice. I visualized the shelter expanding, becoming a beacon of hope for animals in need. I imagined new buildings, better facilities, and a steady stream of donations. I dreamed of a day when every animal in our care would find a loving home. The changes continued to build, each one a little bigger than the last. We received a sizable donation from a wealthy philanthropist who had heard about our shelter and wanted to help. With the money, I was able to hire more staff, improve the facilities, and provide better care for the animals. We expanded our outreach efforts, holding adoption events and partnering with local organizations. And the adoptions kept coming. It was like a dam had burst, and suddenly, there was a flood of families looking to adopt. Cats, dogs, rabbits, every animal that came through our doors found a home. The shelter, which had once been overflowing with animals, began to empty out. I watched with a mixture of amazement and gratitude as each one of them left with their new families, knowing they were going to be loved and cared for. But the biggest change came when I least expected it. One day, a woman walked into the shelter with a proposal that took my breath away. She was the owner of a large animal sanctuary in a neighboring state, and she wanted to partner with us to create a network of shelters that would work together to rescue and rehome animals. She offered us financial support, access to resources, and the opportunity to be part of something much bigger than I had ever imagined. I couldn't believe it. This was the opportunity of a lifetime, and it had come to us at the perfect moment. I agreed without hesitation, and within a few months, our little shelter had become part of a larger network that was making a real difference in the lives of animals. As the months went by, the shelter transformed into something I had never thought possible. We were no longer struggling to make ends meet. We were thriving. The partnership with the sanctuary brought in more resources, more volunteers, and more adoptions. The shelter became a hub of activity, with people coming from all over to adopt, volunteer, or just visit. The stress and worry that had once consumed me were replaced by a deep sense of satisfaction and fulfillment. And the animals, oh, the animals! Every single one of them found a home. Some went to families in the town, others were adopted by people from out of state, but all of them were given the chance to live a happy, healthy life. The shelter, which had once been a place of desperation, had become a place of hope. As I stood in the empty shelter one evening, the last of the animals having just been adopted, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I had done it. I had saved the shelter, not just for myself, but for my parents, for the animals, and for the community. I had manifested the reality I had dreamed of, and it was more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. Looking back, I realized that the journey wasn't just about saving the shelter. It was about saving myself, about finding the strength and courage to believe in something bigger than my fears and doubts. It was about trusting that the universe would provide, even when things seemed hopeless. And it did. The shelter had been my life, my passion, my legacy. But it was also a lesson in the power of faith, of persistence, and of the incredible things that can happen when you believe in the possibility of change. As I locked up the shelter for the night, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything that had brought me to this moment. The animals, the challenges, the people who had helped along the way. It had all led to this. And I knew without a doubt that the future was bright, not just for the shelter, but for all the animals who would come through our doors in the years to come. I smiled to myself as I walked away from the shelter, knowing that this was just the beginning. There were more animals out there who needed help, more people who needed to be inspired, and more lives to be saved. And I was ready for it all, knowing that with the power of manifestation, anything was possible.